Great. Welcome everyone. My name is Ros Smith. I'm Professor of English at ANU and Director of the Centre for Early Modern Studies. We're gathered here today to hear Emma Rayner's exit presentation for her PhD. Something I'm very excited about. I'm just going to introduce Emma. And before I do that, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the lands of the Ngambri and Ngunnawal people, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. So to introduce Emma, Emma's already had a stellar career, even as a PhD student. She began her studies at the University of Freiburg in Switzerland on a Swiss National Science Foundation grant. And then she transferred to ANU on an AGTRP scholarship. During her candidature, she's won numerous prizes and scholarships, including, just to name a few, the Patricia Crawford Publication Prize from CEMS, a scholarship to the University of Virginia Rare Book School, an open Oxford-Cambridge Doctoral Training Partnership Scholarship, and a current European Studies Association scholarship to study in Florence. She's also done a semester abroad at the University of Toronto under the supervision of Katie Larson. All of us in the English department at ANU know Emma to be an excellent and committed tutor, a leader in the postgraduate community, and a wonderful colleague. She's been an absolute pleasure to supervise, an exemplary PhD student, and her work is fabulous. So I'm very, very delighted to be able to introduce her tonight, to listen to her presentation, which will be just under an hour, followed by half an hour of questions and comments. Emma plans to submit her thesis at the end of the year, so any feedback that you can give her would be most welcome. When we do come to questions, could you, and while you're listening to Emma's talk, if you think of anything, could you please put your questions either in the chat or the Q&A, or once we have the question session, we'll open it to respondents and you can just raise your hand and I'll allow you to speak. So with no further ado, take it away, Emma.
Cool, thank you so much, Ros. Just share my screen. Where am I? Play from start. Cool, well, thank you so much, first of all, to Ros for that overly kind introduction. I don't know how much of that is true, but it's very, very nice to hear. And Ros has been a wonderful supervisor as well. And thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time to attend this presentation today. It's great to see so many familiar names in the attendee list. And I'll try to make it as interesting as possible. I also want to say a special thanks to the members of my supervisory panel. So to Ros, my primary supervisor and chair of panel, as well as to my associate supervisors, Dr. Mark Dawson, Professor Indira Ghosh, and Professor Wendy Wall for their invaluable feedback on my doctoral research thus far. Also in absentia to Professor Katie Larson from the University of Toronto. So I'm going to follow this structure for my presentation today in accordance with ANU's requirements for exit presentations. And if I've timed things correctly, like Ros said, this should last for around 55 minutes, just under an hour. So I'll start with objectives, introducing my research question, and then I'll outline the scholarly landscape and my contribution to it. I'll then move on to my results, an overview of my chapter arguments and findings, and I'll end with conclusions, some common threads that I've drawn from each of the chapters. And then that will leave time for Q&A, and I really do welcome any constructive criticism that you might have for me. So, without further ado, let's kick off with objectives. The research question that my thesis project responds to is this: in what ways and through which forms did early modern women engage with discourses of courtesy, conduct, and civility? I've added some asterisks here, just to further specify that my thesis treats primarily but not exclusively female agents who lived in the 17th century, and primarily but not exclusively English women, and writing in English. That's because of an overarching methodological approach that is comparative in spirit, often extending beyond the English tradition and the 1600s to consider the pan-European phenomenon of early modern courtesy, conduct, and civility. And I will refer to these discourses occasionally as triple C discourses, just to avoid so much repetition. So this helps explain too the latitude given in my thesis title, which is, at the moment at least, Fashioning Worth, Early Modern Women and Discourses of Courtesy, Conduct, and Civility. I want to spend a bit of time now breaking down the keywords in this title, as they also help me to outline the broader scholarly field and to point to some of the important methodological dimensions of my research. So to first introduce the notion of fashioning worth, a visual example is illustrative, literally. So the painting that you see on this slide is The Great Picture, a self-portrait commissioned by Lady Anne Clifford in 1646. The painting depicts Clifford at 3 different stages of her life. In the middle, not yet born, in the belly of her mother. On the left, as a young girl, and on the right, aged 56, the formidable courtier, patron of the arts, and writer who had just won a decades-long battle to reclaim her inheritance. These avatars do not, however, stand alone. In one of the many acts of self-fashioning that Clifford performed throughout her lifetime, her teenaged and mature selves can be seen to share the frame of the Great Picture with a number of books, all of which have readable titles. Baldassare Castiglione's celebrated courtesy manual, Il Libro del Cortigiano, the Book of the Courtier, is one of these. And there it is on the lower shelf above Clifford's 15-year-old self. Castiglione's The Courtier is one of 2 books alongside Erasmus's De Civilitate Morum Puerilum on civility in children in English, which are credited with launching a new distinctive phase of civility in early modern Europe. Written during a period of uncertainty for the Italian aristocracy, The Courtier at once aimed to furnish that elite with a sense of legitimacy and self-definition, and served as a blueprint for advancement at court for the new generation of social aspirants. But Castiglione's book was influential far beyond and after that immediate Italian context. Thomas Hoby's 1561 translation of The Courtier was immensely popular with English readers, helping disseminate Italian influence in Tudor England, and giving rise to a vernacular conduct book tradition, which then expanded to include instruction, not just for courtiers, but for gentlemen, merchants, children, and crucially, women. And indeed, given that there were a number of popular conduct books circulating by Clifford's time, either written by or for women, such as Richard Brathwaite's The English Gentlewoman, it's all the more remarkable that she chose Castiglione's manual as her representative of the conduct book genre in The Great Picture. The only other titles which fit into this genre in the painting are several volumes of The French Academy by Pierre de Primaudet. This choice of Castiglione, and indeed of Primaudet, demonstrates what Antoinina Bevans-Lettar characterizes as the aristocratic courtly pedigree of Clifford's bibliophilia. Iconographically, the presence of Castiglione in The Great Picture tells us that Clifford is targeting the cultural capital of the humanist courtier, even as she, to borrow the words of Barbara Lewalski, took on the Goliath of the patriarchal power structure to preserve the interests of a female line. Castiglione's manual has been identified as a preeminent example of Renaissance self-fashioning, a concept introduced by Stephen Greenblatt in his foundational 1980 book of the same name. I, however, have deliberately chosen to drop the self prefix from fashioning in my thesis title, and I'll explain why. Jorge Arreti makes a strong distinction between fashioning and self-fashioning in his book on early modern manners, strongly favoring the latter, self-fashioning, because, as he explains, the courtier is not just someone to be fashioned, he must participate in his own fashioning. So this would seem to be a valid point about agency. The point at which this concept starts to be problematic for female subjects or agents, however, is when we begin to realize that the process of molding oneself points to what Arditi calls the self-referentiality of the technologies and currencies of civility. That's to say that the method for fashioning oneself to acquire courtly grace or honour rests on the imitation of the people in whom, quote, the collective self of the res civile have become the most ingrained. So in the courtier's case, in those who have best mastered the behavioural codes required to win favour with the prince. However, imitatio and integration into this correspondence-based social system was available only to certain subjects whose maleness, whiteness, and social position permitted them to become the mirrors of those already in possession of cultural cachet. Early modern women always perform sameness with a difference, because they were not guaranteed, and in many cases not permitted, to acquire grace or honour in the same way as the male courtier and later aristocrat, through the art of speaking, dressing, dancing, reading, even loving well. So rather than the nominalised self-fashioning, I opt in view of the female agents who constitute the subjects of my research for fashioning as a transitive verb, picking up worth as its direct object. And this formulation better reflects, I think, the virtuosity and perspicacity of early modern women's engagement with CCC discourses, helping to locate the various formal entry points of their contributions and their vexed push and pull with established authorities within such discourses. So that explains what might be termed the post-Greenbladtian resonance of fashioning in my thesis title. What about worth? And looking back across my chapter studies now that they're written, I've realized that what they all put into relief is women's efforts to represent themselves or other female subjects as worthy to take up space, whether that be textual or discursive space, the physical space of the court or educational establishment, even the space of memory. As I have suggested, the straining for worthiness and so for presence in established discourses encompasses but is not limited to self-fashioning. Fashioning worth also stakes a slightly different claim to fashioning virtue, a distinction which comes more clearly into view if we look at the Oxford English Dictionary's definitions of both terms. Virtue is here defined as a moral quality regarded as good or desirable in a person, such as patience, kindness, etc., a particular form of moral excellence. Worth, on the other hand, refers to the character or standing of a person in respect of his or her qualities, abilities, or social rank, a person's merit, excellence, or worthiness. So in my reading, the key distinction here, although subtle, is between virtue as something regarded from the outside as existing within a subject, or which should exist within them, while worth puts an emphasis on accessing the social currency of honour, nobility, and social standing through one's moral excellence. By opting for worth over virtue, I can make the crossing from women's self-representation or self-presentation as virtuous beings to their taking up of space in the discursive infrastructure of 17th century England. Consider Clifford's picture again. Her vaunting of having read Castiglione's celebrated book doesn't paint her as a virtuous reader so much as it spotlights her hard-won social rank and qualities as a courtier, the constellation of practices, including readerly practices, through which she has accessed this elite sphere. These are the kinds of acts of fashioning that I'm interested in my thesis research. So moving on now to the scholarly landscape to which my research contributes. Scholars have yet to demonstrate whether there's a longer, richer story of early modern English women's engagement with CCC discourses than the throwing up of the occasional female reader of Castiglione. A hint of this state of things is found in my introduction, which is titled Invisibility Optics in Early Modern and Scholarly Discourses of Courtesy, Conduct, and Civility. I borrowed the phrase invisibility optics from Margaret Ezel's recent chapter of the same name in A History of Early Modern Women's Writing, which assesses the complex grid of generic, hermeneutic, and political ideological operations by which the works of early modern women writers have been rendered invisible through the centuries. This thesis examines a similar process of erasure with a narrower focus on CCC discourses, with the aim of redressing long-standing assumptions of the absence of women in them prior to the age of the Enlightenment. And you can see on this slide some of the foundational works in the scholarly field of civility and courtesy studies, which traverses the disciplines of sociology, cultural history, anthropology, and literary studies, and more besides. Of particular importance to the field is the pioneering work of Swiss sociologist Norbert Elias, The Civilizing Process, Sociogenetic and Psychogenetic Investigations. And this was translated into English in 1969. Elias's book traces the way in which the seemingly superficial preoccupation with manners and civil behavior seen in the early modern European court was symptomatic of a much more seismic affective and cultural shift. The central argument of the civilizing process is that from the emergence of the first continental books on courtesy around 1500, Europe witnessed the rapid advancement of an increasing threshold of shame. The regime of courtoisie, which prevailed in medieval feudal societies, was thereby displaced by early modern civility. The reduction in interpersonal or group violence that the civilizing turn engendered among the upper and middle classes paved the way for the monopolization of legitimate violent punishment by the state, and led to the conceptualization of civility as a social virtue that made commerce among men agreeable. Scholars have since applied Elias's theory to other national contexts, with Jorge Arditi, Anna Bryson, and Keith Thomas all adapting it to early modern England. And these scholars broadly concur that there was a sea change from courtesy to civility from the Middle Ages through the early modern period. The aim of my thesis is not to trace how or even if medieval courtesy developed into early modern civility. It's not interested in bolstering notions of successive regimes, nor in the stadial theorizing of history, which underpins much work on the civilizing process. This is an approach which would frame the Renaissance as a watershed era in the progressive march of history toward ever more progress, and which would leave the very idea of civilization free of scare quotes. Although I do move chronologically in the order of my chapters from discourses of civility to those of courtesy, through those of civility, part of the aim of my thesis is to show how these discourses continue to coexist in time and space, mutually informing one another, even as, lexically speaking at least, civility became the ascendant term toward the end of the 1600s. What my thesis is interested in, on the other hand, is restoring women's voices to a field which has been dominated by the study of male humanists. According to Gail Kern-Pastor, Elias's seminal work is itself a document of barbarism because of its lack of attention to gender differences in the civilizing process. There is also a notable sidelining of gender in more recent book-length studies of civility and courtesy, often with curious justifications for these omissions. Jennifer Richards, for instance, writes that women are noticeably absent from English conduct and courtesy books, which is categorically at least not true. And Anna Bryson concedes the existence of primers and conduct books for women, but she excludes them from the remit of her study with the explanation that they, quote, focus on domestic or purely ethical themes rather than precepts for social behavior, end quote. As if the latter cannot be embedded in the former, or as if the ethical is mutually exclusive from the social. Indeed, part of the issue seems to be an overly narrow definition of the social or public sphere in which civility or courtesy could be activated, as well as recourse to an overly strict definitional policy in deciding what participates in conduct discourse from a formal perspective. In my thesis, I expand the remit ideologically, spatially, and formally to encompass those female subjects who are very much being captured by the discursive net of ideas about civil commerce and proper conduct in early modern England. Because in fact, women and the feminine occupy a structurally complex position in 17th century CCC discourses. The best example of the complex co-occurrence of women's absence and presence in such discourses is the nature of the civilizing process to begin with. Distilled into its essence, this process, as Elias and others define it, is the domestication of violent or unregulated behavior, which created a newly civil subject in whom archetypically male and female qualities were fused. Arditi argues that the careful calibration of these qualities was vital to the correct gendering of the civilized subject in the early modern period. So the retention from medieval times of the male martial aspect tempered the potential effeminacy of the technologies of self-fashioning, hence assuring the establishment of the subject position itself as masculine. Woman is therefore both excluded from and absolutely necessary to the construction of the early modern civil subject. She's edged out of this subject position at the very time as her essentialized qualities prop it up. Scholars have in recent decades begun to draw attention to and move to redress the concerted effacement of gender and civility studies. Several chapters in the edited collections, Civil Histories and Early Modern Civil Discourses, take up issues of women and gender. Barbara Correll's theoretically informed work on civility is highly gender conscious, and David M. Turner considers gender issues within his study of adultery and civility in early modern England. Looking beyond Anglophone scholarship, experts of 17th century French literature and culture have historically been more alive to these concerns and to women's implication in discourses of civility in both the court and salon contexts. So in this vein, Melinda J. Goff's book on Marie de Médicis' ballets at the court of Henry IV constitutes one recent monograph which makes an explicitly gendered contribution to civility and court studies. However, a sustained investigation of this kind has yet to be produced in the field of early modern English literature. This thesis therefore offers the first extended account of early modern English women's encounters with CCC discourses in the 1600s. My research takes as its primary period of interest a slightly elongated 17th century, stretching back occasionally into the 1590s to catch the twilight years of Elizabeth's reign and the tail of the sonnet craze, and creeping forward into the 1700s to oversee the publication of Mary Astell's writings on education. This period obviously encompasses the decidedly uncivil events of the English Civil War and interregnum and installation of the Commonwealth, which saw prevailing doctrines of proper courtesy, conduct, and civility thrown into question, only to be precariously re-established with the restoration of the monarchy in 1660. I can therefore begin to query how women writers before, during, and after the Civil War capitalized on mutating ideas about civility to critique, or indeed to reinforce, the given order of things when it came to gender rights and roles, and to reshape early modern discourses of courtesy, conduct, and civility to their own political purposes as the century progressed. This is a timely juncture at which to clarify what I mean by discourses. The term likely conjures in the minds of many the Foucauldian concept of discursive formations. These are defined by Foucault very pithily in the Archaeology of Knowledge as, strictly speaking, groups of statements which have come together to form a discursive formation. Notably, discursive formations are historically contingent, their existence predicated on local rules or conditions of possibility. I have personally found the work of neo-Foucauldian scholars Jorge Arditi and Ingo Berensmeyer particularly helpful for conceptualizing discourse in relation to the topoi of civility, courtesy, and conduct. And so I've come to a working definition of discourse as a field of language and practice, which encompasses all utterances that have a shared communicative purpose. In the case of D discourses, these purposes might be related to courtly grace or aristocratic honor, self-fashioning, instruction, notions of civilization, sociability, and so on. As may be evident by this veritable constellation of purposes that I just listed, my research is undergirded by a desire to showcase the sparkling multiplicity, to borrow Patricia Philippi's wonderful term, as opposed to the female uniformity of women's engagement with CCC discourses. This is in a conscious effort to resist the large-scale grand narrative style accounts of the civilizing process from Jacob Burckhardt, Elias, and co., which have been criticized for failing to attend to the specific conditions and texts which made CCC discourses possible and powerful. So, not unlike a series of microhistories which, when aggregated, serve to illustrate larger themes in macrohistory, my case study shed light on multiple dimensions of the topic at hand through close attention to particular historical contexts, agents, and forms. In doing so, they illuminate larger points of connection and shared conclusions, which a next phase of research could extend further. As you can see by my table of contents, each chapter of the thesis addresses a different discourse by way of a different corpus of texts, which span conduct literature, poetry, life writing, libretti, maps, prose fiction, travel accounts, philosophical writings, and more. The first two chapters are dedicated to courtesy, the third chapter to conduct, and the fourth and fifth chapters to civility, although the chapter on Astle also does touch on matters of conduct. And I will obviously run through these in more detail in a moment. These diverse chapter studies are united by my methodological approach. As Ros recently pointed out to me with the supervisor's objectivity, my approach diverges from the dominant material and book history currents coursing through early modern literary studies in favor of a theoretical lens which combines facets of formalism, new feminist formalism specifically, and new historicism. My focus on discourse, which emphasizes the implication of civil, courtly, and conduct-related discourses in Foucauldian technologies of power and Bourdieuian networks of cultural capital, is broadly new historicist. Meanwhile, my conception of form as crucial to knowledge production and my taking up of gender as a central analytical category aligns my approach with a wave of feminist formalist scholarship spearheaded by Lizzie Scott Bauman, Lara Dodds, and Michelle N. Dowd, among others. In particular, I follow Scott Bauman in maintaining that women's choices and use of form reveal their close engagement with their literary and intellectual culture. I also follow her lead in conceiving of women as invoking in their works an interlocutor, perhaps a correspondent, a genre, or a milieu, as Lizzie lists these possibilities. I would replace those potentially with discourse, which they draw from and challenge, and to the development of which they contribute. One of the consequences or upshots of this dialectical emphasis, as Scott Bauman underlines, is to explore women's writings as acts of reading, of recreation, challenge, and appropriation. This way, we can move beyond the notion of servile imitation that has traditionally marked, for instance, writing about women poets' appropriation of Petrarchan discourse, in favor of an approach which emphasizes that push and pull I mentioned within discourse, a wrestling and a revoicing within what Ingo Behrensmeyer calls discursive contexture. And for my purposes, aspects of formal genre, such as intertextuality, rhetorical strategies like prosopopeia and exemplarity, as well as narrative ones like characterization, can reveal so much about the epistemes that inform CCC discourses and women's concepts of how they could leverage the written and visual text to declare and fashion their worth. And this is what my 5 chapters aim to demonstrate. So I will move on to my chapter overviews now. The first 2 chapters of my thesis take up the discourse of courtesy, which, as I've already suggested with reference to Castiglione's The Courtier, refers to the qualities or behaviours ideally expected of people at court, such as, for example, chivalrous conduct. Courtesy manuals, like The Courtier, distinguish sharply, however, between the behaviour required of the male versus the female courtier. On one level, Castiglione extends practical advice to the woman courtier to help her navigate through the volatile heterosexual politics of the court, engaging her in a parallel, though certainly not an equivalent, process to that of male self-fashioning. On the other, he continues to uphold the myth of the untouchable courtly lady from the medieval courtly love tradition, who achieves her high esteem in court or at court through her role as the male courtier's love object and poetic muse. The female courtier of the early modern period is therefore forced to steer a perilous golden mean between these two cultural incarnations of women, as she too tries to access the social mobility that the court did offer to women. So in my first chapter, I take up the very courtly discourse of courtly love, which I was initially drawn to because of the important role it plays in Elias's account of the civilizing process. Elias writes of how as selected feudal courts became centres of literary patronage in 12th century Europe, the troubadours and minnesänger began to circulate in French and German court societies, respectively, singing songs of a refined and refining love between this inaccessible courtly lady or domna and a tortured male subject who was way below her league. According to Elias, such court performers already acted in the direction of stricter drive control, making them essential players in the affective drama of the civilizing process. However, the importance of this fin amour, this refined love, tends in accounts of the civilizing process to fall away with the dawn of the Renaissance. The discourse of love is thereafter sequestered away from scholarship on civility to the domain of literary studies. In those literary studies, the lyrical innovations of Dante and Petrarch are often seen to usher in a newly modern form of desiring subjectivity, and so to usher out fin amour. In this chapter on ennobling desire in Mary Roth's now canonical sonnet sequence, Pamphylia to Amphilanthus, I trace formal continuities between the codified affective regime of medieval fin amour through Renaissance love poetry. I do so by looking at how the medieval and early modern conceptions of the courtly lady collide in Roth's representation of her poetic speaker, Pamphylia. And Roth is a prime candidate for this kind of study because she was a prominent female courtier in James I's court and deeply imbricated in Jacobean court politics and poetics. She even performed alongside Queen Anna of Denmark in several of the court masques that I will mention in the next chapter overview. In her personal life, she pursued an extramarital affair with her cousin William Herbert, the sometimes candidate for the fair youth of Shakespeare's love sonnets. The print version of Roth's sonnet sequence, which was appended to her prose romance, The Urania, when it was published in 1621, demonstrates her effort to project a vision of honour and worth amid this adultery scandal, which seems to have been fairly public knowledge at court. And just to digress slightly back to the idea of fashion and worth, Roth and her admirers often play in their poetry on the similarity of her last name, Roth, to Worth, giving rise to the so-called Roth-Worth pun. In seeking to fashion her own worth, however, Roth had first to rewrite the symbolic economy at the heart of courtly love discourse. From troubadour poetry through Petrarch and his English imitators, the male poet-lover's prerogative had been to grow in virtue, merit, and worth as a result of his devotion to a lady who could not or would not return his advances. The lady's function in what I call the adoration situation is essentially to serve as her lover's instructress in virtuous courtly behaviour, reflecting his own worth and ennoblement back to him. Troubadour Bernard de Ventador even credits his lady with his improved hygiene practices. He says, "Because of her, I'm more joyous and take better care of my body. If it were not for her, I would not make any effort." Just tickles me. But what happens when the lady starts to write back, moving into the subject position? Taking the group of female troubadours known as the Tribyrids as a valuable point of comparison, I examine how Roth breaks through that myth of the courtly lady as mirror to show the emotions roiling the besotted woman's heart from the inside out. I argue, building on Claire Kinney's reading of the Urania, that Roth achieves this through a paradoxical stance of constant change. Anyone who reads Pamphylia to Amphilanthus will quickly realize that it's very hard to trace consistent patterns when it comes to Pamphylia's self-representation, as she's always moving between states, from hotness to coldness, from darkness to fairness, from melancholy to contentment, from states of possession, of vital organs, of power, to states of dispossession. Yet although always changing, Pamphylia is never dissolute, morally speaking, thanks to her shoring up of an immovable base of constancy from which she can authoritatively sing of love. I show how three formal strategies in particular, all originating in that older courtly love discourse, are instrumental in this fashioning of Rothian worth. So namely, Roth's use of Ovidian emotion scripts, the emotion scripts of Narcissus and Pygmalion, through her use of tropes of blackness and whiteness, and these are racially charged in the sonnet sequence, and through her use of the feudal metaphor. And I look here to Roth's most explicit treatment of the courtly love code and service in the Corona sequence. So through close and comparative readings of Roth's poems, I show how she manipulates the discourse of courtly love so that it ennobles and civilizes her female poetic speaker, while sending the abjection and violence that is typically directed toward the courtly lady back at the patriarchal and absolutist forces that lurk in the sonnet sequence's perilous pockets. So that is chapter 1. My second chapter also addresses the discourse of courtesy and the conduct appropriate to the people of the court. This time, though, we're going right to the top of the firm, to the body or bodies who constituted the ultimate model for courtly conduct, the body of the monarch. My interest in the concentration of courtly grace in the royal body is once again prompted by Elias's civilizing process, which underlines the importance of the centralization of power in the early modern court to the emergence of modern behavioral and ethical norms. Scholars, including Jorge Arditi and Christian Hill, have narrowed the vast scope of Elias's state formation thesis to consider the logic of centeredness encapsulated in the idea of divine kingship. So Hill helpfully writes that the spectacle of the absolutist Stuart monarchy in early 17th century England established an essentially spatialized representation of the royal body that created a visual narrative of the monarch as the center of the court and cosmos, which structured all aspects of social space. And you'll note that Hill here mentions court and cosmos, which brings me to precisely the cosmological metaphor that I take up in this chapter. That's the metaphor of the king as sun, which pictures royal grace or magnificence radiating outward from the royal body of the king to other strata of his kingdom, starting with the court society closest to his orbit. This king as sun metaphor amply featured in the early modern court masque, a form of courtly entertainment popular in the first half of the 17th century in England. The masque was a curious mix of drama, dance, and lavish visual spectacle, sponsored by the Stuart monarchy, which essentially functioned as a form of royal panegyric, demonstrating the king's son's ability to disperse forces of chaos and disorder through his harmonizing influence. The Stuart masque has long intrigued new historicist scholars who approach the genre as a dense palimpsest for the analysis of early modern ideologies and beliefs about kingship, sovereignty, and power. However, the form has yet to be close read through the optic of courtesy and civility studies, unlike the Ballet de la Cour in the French scholarly tradition. In this chapter, then, I look at fissures within the formal logic of the masking productions that were engineered by the Stuart queen consorts, primarily Anna of Denmark, but I also touch on a masque in collaboration with Queen Henrietta Maria of France. At a time when women were not permitted to perform the public theatre in England, These foreign queens leveraged the affordances of the courtly setting to act in mask productions before an elite audience. And it was a closed setting in which these productions were performed usually at the banqueting hall of Whitehall Palace. Participation in such productions represented not so much performance as it did an extension of courtly display and sociability, an expression of the behaviour in which the members of the court engaged every day through their conversation, gesture, and dress. This chapter examines the structural metaphor of monarch as sun within the court mask to argue that the Queen Consort's presence serves to fracture the King Sun's omnipotent rays, hence splitting suns in my chapter title. The first section considers an important precedent to the Queen Consort's masking interventions in the form of Queen Elizabeth's fusion of solar and lunar iconography. I then read Ben Jonson's Mask of Blackness and Mask of Beauty, written in collaboration with Queen Anna, with attention to the treatment of the heliocentric metaphor in both productions. Ultimately, we see Queen Anna literally introducing her own female cosmic bodies, most often moons, into the allegorical universe of the mask. Such interventions prompt questions of quantity and of crowding. Just how many royal bodies could be suspended in the masking universe until that universe was no longer able to uphold the all-important metaphor of the single, all-important Sun King? I then trace the co-option of these masked strands of subversive female virtue to Republican political ends in Milton's mask presented at Ludlow Castle, Comus. Milton's mask, which was definitely not performed at the court, is widely agreed to attempt to reform a genre which had, by the 1630s, become strongly associated with the excesses and moral dissoluteness of the monarchical regime and its lewdly pampered court. As Comus's protagonist, the young lady, says, true courtesy oft is sooner found in lowly sheds than in tapestry halls and courts of princes, where it was first named and yet is most pretended. So Milton's mask works to reclaim the discourses of courtesy from their site-specific origin in the royal court, and it does so by its reordering of the mask's cosmological fabric and its resistance to that rex ex machina resolution by way of kingly sunlight. The chapter then ends with a brief discussion of William Davenant's mask, Salmacy Despolia, a Caroline mask which, in its topsy-turvy association of courtly values with chaos, foreshadows the definitive pulling of the king out of his celestial sphere in the form of the 1649 regicide. And the image of courtly grace splintered and strewn across multiple bodies in all of these court masks, or just masks, presages the end of the age of monarchical absolutism in England and the advent of a new relativist understanding of power. And this reinforces Jorge Arati's arguments to the same effect. Right, moving on to my second discourse of conduct, and I have one chapter, my third chapter, dedicated to discourses of conduct. So in my third chapter, I move from the elite context of the court and the sumptuous genre of the mask to that of the household and its associated conduct discourse. I think I just said discourse, sorry. I earlier mentioned the dilation of the courtesy book's remit in the later 16th century to encompass new readerships, as a strong English focus on domestic affairs, combined with the boom in prescriptive religious literature after the Reformation, combined to create a female audience for the conduct book. But women were not only the readers of conduct literature in this period, a select few also contributed to writing it. One of their entry points into this authoritative mode of cultural commentary was via the discourse of parental advice literature. Women had a stake in this discourse owing to the cultural potency of the mother figure in Stuart England, vested by humanist scholars and religious commentators alike, with the power to influence her children, the future members of the Commonwealth, for good or for bad. hence the topic of my third chapter, Mothers' Legacies, and Elizabeth Isham's Book of Remembrance. So this is essentially a comparative study of two genres, or more like one genre and one text, one example of life writing, both of which participate in this discourse of maternal advice. To start then with Mothers' Legacies. These were books addressed by pious mother authors to their unborn or living children, replete with instructions on how to conduct a godly life. They were among the most popular works written by women in 17th century England. Dorothy Lay's Mother's Blessing, first published in 1616, had gone through an astonishing over 20 editions by 1700, so that's just unheard of. Rhetorically speaking, legacies like Lay's read at first like personal wills, their emotional and prescriptive force predicated on the death of the woman who writes. So Lay, for example, presents herself in the preface to her conduct book as going out of the world as her children are but coming into it. They're already taking up this posthumous voice. The overtly gendered brand of maternal zeal advertised in Legacy's prefaces figures forth a kind of every mother figure whose performative femaleness is at odds with the highly didactic, derivative prose which constitutes the instructional portion of her work. And it's these fascinating inconsistencies that have led to interpretive dead ends in extant readings of Mothers' Legacies, and which had me well and truly stumped for a few months there as well. Because existing scholarly readings of Legacies tend to eclipse the destination of these works, that is, the child reader to whom the instruction is directed, by focusing instead on the self-pronounced expiry of the mother author. It's as if the death of the author comes at the cost of the birth of the reader, and not, as in Colombat's famous essay, the other way around. But such readings ignore that legacy books have an explicitly functional end, and that they target conduct in a reality lived beyond the page, not least by furnishing detailed templates for how the godly child reader should pass their terrestrial hours. In transmitting a series of actions and models for behaviour which pass from one subject, the author mother, to another, the child reader, Mother's Advice books triggered a complex reciprocal relation of action and reaction in text and context. This chapter illustrates that relation, or at least one of them, by putting Legacies in dialogue with Elizabeth Isham's Book of Remembrance. Composed between 1638 and 1639, Isham's Book of Remembrance is a manuscript autobiography, one of our earliest and most valuable examples of life writing. Isham's diary initially attracted my interest because of its rendering of the exceptionally matriarchal environment in which its author was brought up at Lamport Hall in Northamptonshire, and also because Isham employs several rhetorical strategies which have in recent years prompted comparisons to the Mother's Legacy. I extend these comparisons by arguing that Isham's spiritual diary activates the meaning inherent in Mother's Advice books, and thanks to Wendy for helping me work out what exactly I was doing there, by demonstrating the transmission of templates for conduct from her own dead mother and grandmother. I specifically focus on how matriarchal exemplarity functions in Isham's text. Isham's method in her book does not resemble that of exemplary rhetoric's humanist practitioner, who plucked liberally from classical history in order to promote ethical precepts or models of behaviour. Neither does Isham exercise exemplarity in the style of Mother's Legacy writers, invoking female biblical types to assemble mini galleries of female worthies. Isham instead draws her exemplar from her late mother's own confessional writings, in which she wrote about experiencing and overcoming a period of severe spiritual doubt and melancholy. Isham refers to her mother's book when she herself experiences or arrives at the pit's brink, a period of apparent depression and loss of faith, drawing consolation from her writings and recopying them word for word in parts of her book. This copying project dovetails with Danielle Clark's conceptualization of memory as exemplarity in the early modern period, the notion that copying, and by extension memorizing, aims at the reinforcement of virtuous, exemplary female conduct. However, there are two important distinctions to be made. Firstly, the conduct Isham imitates after her late mother is not straightforwardly exemplary. And secondly, she does more than just copy it. In something akin to a process of sanctification, Isham reproduces material, matriarchal experience and counsel in such a way that transforms quite viscerally negative, affective, or behavioral examples into defensively virtuous ones. So Isham's very act of following these matriarchal blueprints seems to make the original link in the chain exemplary. Not unlike Pamphilia's constant shape-shifting in Roth's sonnet sequence, Isham's straddling the functions of mother author and child reader in her manuscript diary allows her to avoid clear taxonomization as either Madonna or monster, while offering an alternative to her heroic or biblical exemplarity that is grounded in real bodies and their sometimes ugly feelings. Moreover, reading Isham's diary as an alternative reception history of maternal advice serves to disrupt the prevailing vision of the civilizing process as individualistic, self-contained, or as producing individualistic and self-contained subjects. My comparative study shows instead how female subjectivity, identity, and conduct were dispersed across generations and bodies, drawing attention to the fungibility, not the sealedness, of corporeal and indeed of textual borders. Okay, moving now to my two chapters on civility. The first of these, chapter 4, takes up the critical matter of civility's relation to race and race-making in the so-called Age of Discovery. Civility in the sense of politeness and cultivation was from the first defined in relation to the barbarous, the savage, and the foreign, which increasingly meant in the 17th century in relation to the racial other. Just so, Patricia Akemi's recent monograph, Shakespeare and the Cultivation of Difference, has highlighted the discourses of conduct, civility, and cultivation's role in impressing somatic difference. And I hope to build on her work with my contribution here. I focus elsewhere in this thesis on the facet of civility which is related to self-representation or self-fashioning. In this fourth chapter I also take up the second accommodative dimension of civility in addressing race and the contact zone. 16th and 17th century books of manners put into relief the demand for adaptability, the avoidance of offence, and the accommodation of the self to the needs of others that lies at the heart of cultivation and civilized behaviour. In the early modern contact zone, however, Europeans' imposition of a social ideal of accommodative civility in exchanges with Indigenous peoples and slave populations is revealed to be deeply disturbingly ironic in view of the colonial violence that underwrites these interactions. The forms of civility deployed in the contact zone emerge as particularly vexed when one adds gender into the mix. Feminist critical race scholars, guided by the pioneering work of Kim F. Hall, have shown how early modern English women achieved authorial legitimacy and constructed their white, civilized subjectivity through and against their representations of alterity, especially of racialized women. At the same time as my thesis strives to make women visible within discourses of civility and courtesy then, it acknowledges that the white, mostly upper class European women whose interventions it examines themselves complexly participated in the processes of racialization and colonial oppression under the aegis of the civilizing process. In chapter 4, entitled "'Twas No Matter Where, Mapping Civility in Afroben's Orinoco," I take up the early modern genre most explicitly implicated in the ostensibly civilizing process or project of imperial expansion, the travel narrative, the fictional travel narrative in this case. Ben's Orinoco, or The Royal Slave, has been identified as the first work of English literature to grasp the global interactions of the modern world, as Europeans began to fill in more and more of the blank spaces on the world map through travel and colonial expansion, laying in the process the awful groundwork for the transatlantic slave trade. Ben's canonical prose fiction tells the story of the eponymous African prince, the civil and gallant Orinoco, who's tricked into slavery and transported across the Atlantic to Suriname, which at the time the novel is set was an English colony in South America. So much has been written about the hybrid generic identity of Orinoco, its vexed mix of realism and romance. This chapter contributes to the scholarly discussion by arguing that Orinoco is, in effect, a romance which wants to activate the discourses and geographies of civility found in fanciful French heroic romance, but which finds itself beleaguered by anchors of reality, the reality of racial difference, the reality of unknown and impassable foreign terrain, the reality of colonial brutality and English barbarism. I look at how this realism romance tension plays out in the textual cartography of Orinoco, which merges the allegorical or romantic conceptions of place found in works of contemporary French heroic romance by precious authors. And these are authors who Ben would have known intimately through her work as a translator from French to English. So between those, on the one hand, and the real geographies found in eyewitness travel accounts and increasingly detailed world maps on the other. I consider Ben's representation of place against several maps, but I'll just mention one here, which is probably familiar to many of you, Madeleine de Scudéry's Carte Tendre, or the Map of Tendre. This is an allegorical map depicting the fictional and feminized land of Tendre, designed in the salon to teach men how to maintain respectful, platonic friendships with women. The important point for me here, though, is that Scudéry's map does not depict a foreign land. It activates what Marie Pioffet and others call the insular imagination characteristic of heroic romance, to depict an island-like space where civilizing activity can proceed uninhibited by realities of difference. In the real-world setting of Orinoco, however, alterity, racial, linguistic, topographical, climatic, cannot be neutralized by the civilizing rhetoric of 17th century romance, try as Ben's narrator might. I analyze how Ben tries to account for the blank spaces in her novella's map, or to try to manage space through the following romantic civilizing conventions. So I look at the salon-style heroic map portrait of Orinoco's face. I look at how she plays with scale in her depiction of the narrator's anglicized dwelling at St. John's Hill. And I look to her activation of an insular imaginary in the depiction of the land of Suriname, attempting in vain to gather in the vast space of the South American continent. Ultimately, and not surprisingly, these strategies fail to halt Orinoco's tragic trajectory in Suriname, which ends in his brutal execution by dismemberment. As cracks begin to show in the cartography of Orinoco, civility is exposed for what it often was in colonial spaces. At its best, a circumscribed provisional social glue, and at its worst, a deformative force that insidiously works to prohibit the real of racism and the violence enacted upon territories and bodies in the name of mercantile imperialism, a vital arm of the civilizing project. Okay. So journeying back to England from these foreign climes for my fifth and final chapter, which also addresses a discourse of civility, I take up the published works and marginalia of philosopher and theologian Mary Astell. Astle has been classed as the first English feminist, and as such, she's often discussed in relation to the later and better known vindicator of the rights of women, Mary Wollstonecraft. This chapter, however, looks backward to the 17th century to instead situate Astle's writings in relation to the specific discourses of civility which informed French works like Scudery's Carte de Tendre, which I just mentioned. Specifically, I argue that Astle may have had close to mind, while formulating her own position on English women's education, the cautionary figure of the French femme savante, the learned or educated woman. The femme savante had won her ticket into the polite 17th century public sphere by mastering certain performative forms of knowledge, which allowed her to act as a civilizing agent for men in the salon context. And just to mention my sources here briefly, I look to Astle's best-known print works concerning female behaviour and education, a serious proposal to the ladies, part 1 and part 2, and some reflections upon marriage, as well as to the marginal comments that she made in the volumes of the recently discovered books she donated to the University of Cambridge's Magdalen College Library, in which I was fortunate enough to examine last year. Through tracing a connection from the learned Englishwoman to her French sister, this chapter seeks to determine whether Astle's philosophical template for women's improvement can, despite its strong critique of this worldly or mundane woman, still be understood as properly sociable, especially when compared to the appeal to civil subjectivity that marks contemporary thought by both Descartes and the Précieuses. Since Astle's writings don't contain an explicit theorization of civility or its role in female enlightenment, I approach her oeuvre as Frédéric Lelong recently has Descartes, in search of an ethical tone or a philosophical attitude which allows us to treat certain questions which the author did not necessarily formulate as such. To locate this philosophical attitude, I first put Astle's writings in dialogue with several French works which participate in the 3 discourses of civility in which I'm interested. Galanterie, which can be translated as gallantry, honnêteté, which is a lot more difficult to translate but approximates respectability, I think, and préciosité, préciosity, the female-led literary movement towards refinement in 17th century France. And for anyone who is interested, here is a quick glimpse of the titles that I'm treating within these 3 discourses, and I'm happy to touch on any of these in the Q&A if of interest. Okay, I then turn to consider the second part of Astle's serious proposal, which proposes a retreat-like religious academy for women that will teach its female members how to access and hone their God-given reason. Astle therefore reforms not only the femme savante, but the forum in which she could feasibly exist, imagining a space where women could, through genteel sociability, act as civilizing influences onto each other. And as she writes, is it not the fitting ourselves to do real services to our neighbours a better expression of our civility than the formal performance of 1,000 ridiculous ceremonies, which everyone condemns and yet no one has the courage to break through? So that gives a taste, I think, of Astle's critique of civility. Astle's academy did not, however, become a reality in her own time, and it was heavily criticised both then and now for the escapist attitude, and I would even add there the insular imaginary, which seems to undergird her proposal. There's a sense in which Astle's advanced thought about women's intellectual capabilities ran ahead of the social institutions or infrastructures at her disposal in England, and in an England that was experiencing a conservative crackdown on female behaviour following the excesses of the Restoration. Yet even if Astle had to project a better world into an afterlife in her own time, It is certain that her writings, informed by dialectical engagement with the contemporary philosophical and literary currents out of France, helped imagine an improved world for future generations of women, and to shape the enlightened lady who might live in it, perhaps an English femme savante. For my part, I hope that this chapter highlights, for the first time in the case of scholarship on Astle, the important place of civility or its critique in the first stirrings of feminist philosophy. Okay, coming to the end, I promise. In my conclusion, which I have yet to write, I'm going to reflect on the sparklingly varied nature of women's engagement with CCC discourses, but I'm also going to pull out some common threads which have emerged across my chapter studies. Indeed, the surprising number of recurring motifs and themes which have emerged from my chapter studies prompts reflection on those practices of similarity or the system of resemblance that I mentioned in my introduction, through which early modern male subjects could win honour or grace in the social infrastructure. There's a kind of discursive order of its own which emerges from my thesis project as a whole, founded in a logic of correspondence rather than of direct causal relation. And that's something that I would like to think about further as I write up this conclusion. So feedback is very, very welcome. These are the adhesive factors that order that discourse, or which I've identified for the moment at least. Common threads. So the first is the fact that many of these interventions seem to be tied up with matters of love, courtship, and romance. So I can think of courtly love, obviously, in Roth's sonnet sequence, of maternal zeal in The Mother's Legacy, of the conventions of romance in Ben, and something I didn't touch on, the importance of self-love in the writings of Astle. Another common thread is an emphasis on change and mutability, paradoxically enabled often by the solid ground of virtue. This is on show in Pamphilia's constant change, in Isham's slipping between the roles of reader and author, mother and child, in the costume and disguise changes in The Court Mask, and in the changing, mutating landscape of Orinoco. Related to this point seems to be a preoccupation with visualizing space and, once visualized, reorganizing it. So I'm thinking about the rearranging of the macrocosm that we see in the Queen Consort's interventions in Stuart Masks, but also the management of space in Orinoco, that gathering in tendency, and of course the notion of territory in terms of colonial expansion, and in Astle, physical space in which women could hold civilizing conversations. Lastly, there seems to be a kind of increasing and progressive emergence of an emphasis on intersubjectivity and collectivity the further that my chapter studies progress. So we go from a Roth or a representation of Pamphylia, which is quite lonely in some ways. And of course, the example of the Queen Consorts, they are in a very exceptional social and cultural position. But that starts to change with Isham and with the kind of reforming of exemplarity to touch familial relations rather than those with heroic subjects. And then, of course, this emphasis on almost a monist body of women moving as one in Astle's proposal for her academy. So musing for a final moment on this research's significance in our current peculiar moment of 2023, I want to gesture to the renewed interest in civility as an accommodative mode of discourse, which may help to smooth over increasingly splintered political and ideological divides and render public conversation possible in the 21st century. There was a marked resurgence of this talk, for instance, after the attack on the US Capitol, with many calling for a recommitment to justice, to civility, to decency. Again, though, we have to ask whose civility, and to ensure that women's voices are not lost in the process of tracing this newly popular concept's origins back to the Renaissance. If we don't, we'll be left with takes like this one from Freud in Civilization and its discontents. He says, women, because representative of the interests of the family and sexual life, come into opposition to civilization and display their retarding and restraining influence. So apparently we're doing the retarding and restraining. By actually considering women's engagement with CCC discourses, their active fashioning of worth, we can start to glimpse the role of female agents in the civilizing process. And I hope that my thesis research proves that this is a much richer and more kaleidoscopic tale than one could have dared extrapolate from the single copy of The Courtier on Anne Clifford's painted bookshelf. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emma, for a wonderful paper. That was great. Can you see me, Emma, on your screen?
I can see you now, yes.
Side by side, great, excellent. So I'll open the floor to questions. You can either raise a hand and I can allow you to speak, or I can, just something's gone wrong with my view, or if you could put your questions in the Q&A and the chat, that would also be great. While everyone's gathering their thoughts, like I have lots of questions for you, of course, Emma, but I was wondering, I'll just ask you a single question. I was just wondering about what the relationship you see between the CCC discourses, between conduct, courtesy and civility, and do they have the same kind of emphases during the 17th century, or do you know what's the relationship between them as discourses?
Like what and what nature of relation?
I just sort of mean you're sort of discussing them as sort of separate entities in different chapters, but do they bleed into one another? Do they have kind of, at the beginning of the 17th century, is it more about conduct rather than civility? Do you know, how do they work together kind of within the period that you're talking about, and with women's engagement with them?
Yeah, no, it's a good question in it. So I think I had two choices of how to frame the thesis. One was to encompass all of those discourses under the notion of civility, which is what someone like Elias does in the civilizing process, as he talks about. Well, I think you've frozen, Roz. Can you still hear?
I can still hear you. Yeah, you just glitched for a little minute.
Hello?
Yep, I can still hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay. So Elias kind of subsumes, courtliness and civility and
oh, Emma, you're
well, it's breaking up a bit, but I can
stable.
Try to answer your question.
It's okay. Yeah, I can hear you now. Seems okay.
Okay, I think I'm back. I think that was on my side, wasn't it?
Yeah,
all
it's
right.
fine on mine.
Should we try again? All right. So yeah, I was just saying that Elias very much subsumes notions of courtliness and his study of conduct literature within civility as an umbrella term. And that's initially what I did in my thesis as well. And I've only recently kind of rejigged it to pull out these discourses as distinct. There is courtesy, there's conduct, and there's civility. And I do think that they have quite distinctive features. And when I was talking about conduct books, for instance, like The Mother's Legacies, there's not always this introduction of ideas about civility or the civilizing of oneself, especially not in those female authored ones. So I had to, I think, separate out them as discourses, but at the same time, I very much agree that they are bleeding into and mutually informing each other. And so, for instance, in the Astle chapter, it was difficult to decide which was the dominant discourse there, whether it was civility, courtesy, or conduct, because courtesy does also come in there in her critique on courtship practices and that kind of traditional courtly love dynamic. So I'm not sure if, yeah, I mean, they're absolutely in dialogue in the century. In my effort to impose a bit of order on my study, I perhaps make them seem more distinct than they were. But I did try to emphasize at the beginning of the presentation that I do see them as mutually informing.
Yeah, I'm not really saying that as a criticism. I'm just kind of curious in how they work together. You know,
right.
Definitely informing one another. You know, they're not distinct. Yeah, so I just want you to talk a little bit more about that. So we've got a couple of questions here from Scarlett. She's just saying she really enjoyed the presentation. She said this is not a question but a comment. It's just someone unfamiliar with early modern studies, all arguments and concepts were clearly explained and illustrated, and the conceptual threads are elegantly drawn across the chapters.
Oh, Scarlett.
Has a comment.
Thank you, Scarlett.
Thank you, Emma. What a stellar presentation. I was wondering if you see similarities or differences in the reorganising of space in Masks and in Ben, and also wondering how you're defining space, place too. That might be a longer question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really good questions. Thank you, Claire. And these are things I'm trying to work through at the moment, because I've just discovered a couple of articles about the treatment of geography in the court mask, because they do often deal with exotic climes, and also with ideas of insularity and of Britain as a fixed isle with everything else kind of spinning around it. So there are absolutely connections to be drawn between that genre and how space is operating in Ben. Can I think of some similarities or differences? Space. Yeah, I suppose one of the major differences would be that these masks are so concentrated on Britain, you know, as an island, and everything. It's so central to the rest of the world. It's kind of the artificial center of the map, right? And then in Ben, we're leaving Britain and she's having to wrestle with that kind of peripherality, or a feeling of that. And I think in her imposition of these warped kind of cartographies, that's an attempt to recenter that colonial space on the map and inject a certain amount of Britishness or Europeanness into it. So that will be one of the main differences. And how am I defining space and place? Space and place. How indeed? I think I'm going to have to think about that one. Do you think I should think about place as well and not just space? Maybe I can ask Claire later.
Yeah, Claire, I mean, I can allow you to speak if you'd like to talk a little bit more about your question.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Emma. That's just such a phenomenal presentation. Well done. I'm happy to chat more. Yeah, I'm interested in kind of the differentiation between space and place. And I think what you're doing is really fascinating. I was especially struck by what you were saying about masks and potentially kind of female use of space. So yeah, happy to chat later. That's a tricky question and there's lots of answers to it. So I guess I was wondering if you were using kind of any theories of place or space to help you with that.
Yeah, I think that I should be, and it's one of the things on the to-do list really, is to figure out also the relation, or how I'm visualizing public versus private space toward the end of the 17th century.
Yeah.
And how these chapter studies are perhaps revealing the modulation of ideas around those spaces. So
I'll flick you a book that I think might be useful on email, but it's such a comprehensive thesis, and I'm not sure you need any more. It's amazing. Well done.
Oh, I think it was a info dump. I'm so sorry, but thank you, Claire.
It's wonderful. Don't be sorry. It's fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
I was a huge amount of ground, your thesis. You know, and that means that there are those moments where, you know, you are invoking things like cartography and maps in ways that are sort of useful in that specific sort of context of the chapter, but are not really kind of engaging with those bigger debates around, say, SEM plays. Are there any more? Oh, here's another more question. So this is from Anakin Myers. Hello and thanks, Emma. I'm wondering whether you encounter the word culture at all in connection with your 3 Cs, or is it used perhaps only in relation to non-English cultures?
Interesting. I haven't, I guess, encountered that as a term as much as obviously courtesy, conduct, and civility, but it is tied up in this idea of cultivation. So it would be part of that constellation of terms, I suppose. Perhaps is it only used in relation to non-English cultures? I would have to look back at the sources to be able to respond to that, I think, and to see how culture is being used by early modern authors, because I don't have any examples that are coming to mind right now. But it's an interesting question and something that I should check out for chapter 4, absolutely.
Questions? Are there any further questions? I know the evening's wearing on for people. I'll just give you another minute or so just to have a think about it. If there's anything else you'd like to suggest to Emma or to ask her about her presentation. Well, if not, could you join me in thanking her for a genuinely wonderful exit presentation that gave, like, I think such a great sense of the breadth of her thesis and kind of the ways in which she kind of is intellectually engaging with some really big concepts, but bringing them down into these really quite dense, intriguing and inventive case studies that will, I hope, change our view of how we think about early modern women and civility. I particularly loved, Emma, those last slides where you're drawing all the threads together, because I can see, you know, really how significant this thesis is going to be for the field. So thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
And it's a thanks from Amelia as well. Okay. Oh, well. Great. Thanks, everyone.